sorry, we had a bit of an echo there. Thank you so much for joining us here on the CCOF webinar, Nitrogen Management and Budgeting. We really appreciate you getting on the line, and thanks so much for those of you who decided to join us early. It's always a good idea because webinars tend to be kind of tricky with the technology. So we appreciate you being here with us, and we're going to get started. We have a really great program for you today. We have two really fabulous experts. If you are having any type of difficulties, if you can't hear or you can't see, please call our office for support. The number here is listed below, 831-423-2263, extension 87. Again, that's 831-423-2263, extension 87. And Rachel Whitty, who's the executive assistant to Kathy Kalfel, will help you get on the line. For those of you who haven't been on a webinar, just a quick brief on how to participate today. You can switch between different functions. It should be on the right-hand side of your computer screen. There's a participants button, a chat button, and a question and answer button. You can also open and close that panel by clicking on the top bar of it if you want to get rid of the panel and you don't want to see any of the fuss that's happening on the right-hand side and you just want to concentrate on the screen itself. Please use the chat function to send us any questions you might have, or if you're having technical difficulties, and use the Q&A button if you would like to send a presenter specifically or the host any type of question and answer. You can also raise your hand, which is that red box in the middle there on the right-hand side. There's a little hand-raising signal, and that means you'd like to verbally ask a question. We do have the power here to unmute you, and you'll be able to be heard just as if you were calling into a radio program show. All right. Just a quick bit about our presenters today. Many of you probably know Amigo Bob. He's an internationally recognized pioneer in the modern organic farming movement. He has his career spans 40 years and spans all aspects of the organic and local food movement, from organizing food co-ops to retail stores, wholesale distribution, diversified organic farming, farm and garden supply, food processors. He's a homesteader. He's an heirloom plant propagator. He's an organic farm advisor. He's a farmer organizer. He's an educator. He's a technical writer. He's an inventor, and he's a political activist. And as a side note, he also co-founded CCOF. Also with us today is Karen Lowell. She's a PhD, an agronomist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and she's a California Certified Crop Advisor. She works with individual farmers as well as a wide range of public and private partners supporting farmers as they manage conservation challenges in a complex production, market, and regulatory climate. Much of her work focuses on nutrient, irrigation water, and pest management strategies, as well as the use of cover crops and other management practices that may support soil health. Karen was an agricultural extension agent in Sierra Leone, West Africa, with the Peace Corps, and she's got an MS degree in agronomy from the University of Maryland and a PhD in soil, crop, and atmospheric science with a minor in horticulture from Cornell University. And I am not a presenter today, but I'll be your host. My name is Jessie Beckett, and I work for the CCOF Foundation, and I help run educational programming like this type of event for CCOF. So thank you for joining us. And with that, we are going to pass it over to Karen, who's going to lead us through some fabulous things on nutrient management and preparing a nutrient budget. Take it away, Karen. Karen, are you there with us?
I'm talking. Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Many of you may be familiar with Natural Resources Conservation Service. We're part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture with a primary mission to support farmers and ranchers working on private lands and their conservation objectives. So, around the country, and certainly throughout all of California, we're addressing some pretty significant nutrient management challenges and increasing pressure from both market entities and regulatory entities to demonstrate good stewardship of I looked around to see what we had that was helpful, and short version of what I learned was we had a lot of spreadsheets, but not a lot of information that helped folks really get some information out of them that might help them make management decisions or provide information to the people that want information from them regarding their management strategies. And so what I'm going to show and share with you today is an approach that I've sort of developed over the last couple of years working. I've tried to work actually starting outside the agency and talk with folks like many of you on the phone today, people who are managing agricultural production systems, try to figure out what would be useful and in what form for you, and then carry that back inside the agency and say, this is how we can best support folks. How can we structure our programs to deliver that? So I'm hopeful that you will provide some feedback either during question and answer or afterwards directly to me by email, because the intent here is to be useful, and to the extent that we are, that's great. To the extent that there's something we can do to improve the delivery of service, I appreciate that, and my skin is thick. You can offer it however you need to. You don't need to make feedback pretty for me. Jesse, do I have the screen control? I think I do.
Yeah.
So it's not advancing for me, Jess.
Hold on just one second. Try now.
I'm just clicking it as I normally do, and it's not going anywhere. You want to advance for me, and I'll keep going. Maybe we can figure it out.
Sure, we'll do that.
Okay. So what we're going to do today, Amigo and I have spoken ahead of time and tried to sort of think through how we can not duplicate what each of us has to offer you today. So a roadmap of where we're going, I'd say, in the whole session today, we're going to talk about, Jesse, do you have the slide switched already?
It should say roadmap for our session today.
Okay, it doesn't on my screen. I don't know if it does on other participants' screen. Just want to make sure we're moving along. It might be worth taking a second to get this right.
Sure thing. All right, hang on just a second, folks. Like we said, webinars are emerging technology.
Okay, now it's switched.
All right,
thank you. So we're going to talk about sort of key elements of nutrient management, just sort of an overview. And then I'm going to focus a lot on a nutrient budget. And the reasons for that I'll discuss a little bit more as we go along here. I think most people who are managing successfully in agricultural systems have some sort of budget in their mind. And I think what we're pushing for, what we're not pushing, but what the various management forces that are, economically, fertilizer gets more expensive, even the organic sources, and even perhaps especially the organic sources in some cases. And as I said, market and regulatory forces are increasingly asking for some documentation. So why prepare it? There's lots of different reasons, and I'm sure each of you would add your own. So we're going to break it down looking at what are the inputs, and then very, very critically, there's what goes in, but there's also what does your plant actually see at the time and in the form that it needs it for optimum growth and performance. And then thinking about how do you estimate what you need and when you need it, and where can you get some information about that. In the advertisement for this session, I think it talked about innovative approaches to managing nitrogen impacts and nutrient management. And I would say one of the things that has definitely advanced significantly in the last several years is the ability to monitor and track information. And some of the electronic systems that are available to you may be very useful to you in your planning. So you can think about that as we're going along, how you might manage to capture and use the information that we're going to talk about. So what are the key elements for nutrient management? I'm going to cover the first two bullets fairly quickly and focus primarily on the nutrient budget. The primary, when you're thinking about nutrient management and making sure what your crop needs is there at the right time, you're thinking about what source are you applying, what rate are you applying, when are you applying it in the plant growth stage, and in terms of what might move that nutrient out of the root zone before your plant sees it, and the place you're applying it. So you're side dressing, or you're incorporating it, you're broadcasting it. How are you placing that material in the production environment? So that's kind of a quick, big picture overview of nutrient management. And of course, because many of the nutrients are very mobile in the soil environment, thinking about water management is very important, particularly with nitrogen. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, but if you're really trying to dial in your nutrient management, you definitely want to be thinking carefully about when you're applying water relative to when you're applying soluble nutrients, when you're taking samples. You're taking a soil sample and then using that information, 3 months later when you're planting. Any nitrogen you measured in that initial soil sample is long since changed if there's been significant irrigation or rainfall. So all of the factors that influence movement of nutrients, I'd say probably water, rainfall, or irrigation are critical to manage. Can't manage rainfall. We certainly learned that this year, but you can manage your irrigation water. And then the last one, as I said, that I'm going to focus on is a nutrient budget. So why do this nutrient budget? Lots of different reasons can help you plan your management. It can also help you can use a nutrient budget to look ahead and think about what you would want to apply, when, how, in what form, and so on with those 4 R's as a guidance. You can also use it to look back and evaluate how close to the mark you came in terms of supplying what you thought you were for your plant use, and that would take the form perhaps of pulling some samples post-production to look at what you're leaving behind in residual nutrients that may be lost before you're cropping again, before you're planting your next cycle. Obvious reasons to think about nutrient management: to optimize your yield and quality and to avoid problems that might result not only from inadequate supply, but in the case of over-application, of off-site impacts that might occur if you're losing nutrients off the farm system to runoff or leaching that can have impacts on surface or groundwater quality. So if you break it down in its simplest form, the basic parts of any budget are going to be what are the inputs and what do you need? What do you need to have available? So in the process I'm going to run through with you today here, I'm going to talk about sort of systematically thinking through, deliberately thinking through, what are my inputs and how do I find accurate information to estimate what they are. And then we'll talk about how do we estimate, okay, that's what went in, how much of that do I realistically expect my plant to be able to see at the time, the growth stage, and the time at which it most needs it for optimum yield and quality of the crop. And then thinking about, and how much should I expect my crop to need? How do I estimate what it needs at what time and what place in the production system? So thinking through what are the inputs, there are the fairly obvious ones, or things like fertilizer, compost. More recently, there's been increasing attention on asking producers to document the amount of nitrogen that may be applied with irrigation water. In many cases, depending on where you might be pulling water from, you could have fairly elevated levels of soluble nitrogen in that water. So thinking through how much of that might be included in a production budget has become increasingly requested, demanded, you choose the word, by in particular regulatory entities. But in many cases, it is a significant amount of nitrogen being added, so you would certainly want to include it in a budget for your own management purposes. And of course, as mentioned, you can pull a soil sample and look at the amount of nitrogen available, keeping in mind, as I said earlier, that that is a fairly ephemeral number. It changes rapidly. If there's any water moving through that soil profile, you're going to change the amount of nitrogen. You may lose some to other biological factors too, microbial immobilization or volatilization. You can lose some of that nitrogen. So I guess if it's not clear yet, I'll just state it overtly. Nutrient management is sort of, there's a lot of science to it. There's also a significant amount of judgment and individual experience that comes into play to understand how things are all working in your own system. And to the extent that you're able to get information specific to your management system, you will be able to dial that in more precisely. There are opportunities to do things. For example, soil nitrate quick test can be used to pull a quick, right now, what is in your soil in the form of nitrate that your plant might be able to access, as opposed to pulling a soil sample, sending it to a lab, and waiting. By the time you get that sample back, depending on what happens in between, the nitrogen number in particular may not have a lot of management value. So that's a lot. I've just talked about a couple things, but there's a lot of information that I'm asking, that we're asking folks to think about as they consider what are the inputs and how much of that should I think about as being available. So this spreadsheet that is showing now, I asked Jesse to send ahead to you folks. You, I think, have the blank version of it. I've just used a sort of a dummy mock-up of an operation to walk us through it today in this presentation. But the intent here is to provide sort of a scaffolding to structure the discussion or structure the thought process of making sure you've sort of considered each of the major inputs that might come into your cropping system. So this spreadsheet, you might want to have it in front of you if you've printed it out, because it'll be easier to read. I apologize, it's pretty small, but I wanted to show people what we were talking about here. You also should have a Word document that looks like this, showing on the screen now. And this document, I would strongly recommend, if you want to use this type of documentation, read this document first, because it will help you understand where you're looking for the information and what the numbers are doing in that spreadsheet. There's not, I learned over talking to folks over the last couple of years and prior to coming to the agency, punching numbers into a spreadsheet doesn't mean a whole lot unless you understand what it's doing. Why is this number being calculated in such a way? And what are the assumptions that are being made as it's being calculated as an available source or as a total available or total applied? So what this Word document does is it sort of walks you through, and here it is in larger form, it walks you through each of the line items in the, it doesn't want to go down any further, Jeff. Well, you have to take my word for it. It walks you through the spreadsheet line item by line item and helps you understand what that information means and how you might use it in guiding your management decisions. So just starting with the first element, you would want to pull a soil sample at some point and pull from that soil sample. Generally, people are looking primarily at your organic matter, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and macronutrients, and your pH. If you have, for this purpose, I'm going to focus on nitrogen, but you would, of course, want to pay attention to your micronutrients, as although they are present and used in smaller quantities, they may severely impact your crop performance. So you want to pull the numbers off of that, and then you're going to go take them to the spreadsheet and enter them here. So what I've done here is I've entered the numbers from the soil test that we just looked at over here, the 2.3 organic matter, 69 for nitrate, 51 for phosphorus, and so on, and I've just plugged them in over here. The nitrate number 69, you'll see in the gray box, it's now calculated that as 276. That's an estimate of the pounds of nitrogen that are available at the point in time the soil sample was pulled in the top 12 inches of that soil. The phosphorus level and the potassium level are just noted here that we don't calculate because the nature of the soil test for that is a little different. We don't calculate that as a pounds per acre available. But they give you an indication that you can compare, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. And then the soil organic matter, some amount of nitrogen will be released as microbial organisms mineralize that organic matter and release some of the organic nitrogen. And the gray box calculates based on best estimates in a wide range of conditions what you might expect to get from your soil organic matter. You can read the assumptions that the calculation in the gray box are based on in that Word document that I showed you a moment ago. Okay, so then for the irrigation water, typically it's pulled as nitrate, and they may give you nitrate nitrogen, which is typically shown as it's written here in this pink box with the -N. If they don't, then you need to calculate from the nitrate value how much of the nitrate is actually nitrogen, because you're not interested in the oxygen, you're interested in the nitrogen. So if you take the nitrate value times 0.222, then you get the amount of nitrate or nitrogen in that water. And from that, you can then estimate how many pounds of nitrogen. If you know the concentration in the water, you can, using a factor, a multiplicative factor, you can calculate about how many pounds of nitrogen you're adding per acre inch or acre foot of water. So in the example that I'm working through here with you now, I was working it through a strawberry crop. So if you assume you're applying 30 acre inches of water, the gray box here, see I've entered here that the calculation, the nitrate nitrogen is 14. We applied 30 acre inches of water to that crop. The gray box here calculates how much nitrogen is added with the irrigation water. And I just tell you a story for those who might doubt that you can add a significant amount of nitrogen. I had an organic producer I was working with who was very, very pleased with production and noted that she didn't add any fish emulsion or any other nitrogen-containing materials and was getting great production. And we looked at her well water test, and she had 200 parts per million nitrate in her water, which calculates to about 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre inch of water. So it can be a very significant input for a production system. I would urge you to look closely at the the water analysis if you've got that much nitrogen in your water, because it may be that there are other issues with that water that would be less beneficial, like salts or other components of the water that would be problematic for production. So don't simply be happy if you have high nitrogen, because you may have other issues that would preclude using that water as abundantly as might seem like a good idea. Okay, many folks will add compost, and you typically, if you make your own compost, you may not have an analysis available unless you send it out, which I would encourage you to do, because it'll give you much more valuable information about how to manage that as a resource. If you purchase it, you should be able to get a ticket of analysis from the compost supplier. This is from a supplier, and so we have the analysis here, and the numbers are blown up here in the top box, showing the percent moisture, which is important. What you're going to do is enter that on the spreadsheet that I sent you. There are tabs along the bottom, and we're going to pull these numbers here that are in the gray shaded box and enter them in one of the tabs along the bottom of the spreadsheet. You have the nutrients in organic amendments, and so you're going to enter those numbers in here, and it will tell you how many pounds of nitrogen, P2O5 in the oxide form and K2O in the oxide form, which are how fertilizer materials are typically labeled, right? NPK is actually N, and then P2O5 and K2O. So you carry those over, and you can put those numbers now down in soil, in the amount of nitrogen, P2O5, and K2O added with your compost materials. So you see how this is working. We're just plugging the numbers in, systematically working down to find all the sources of inputs. Many people cover crop, and you want to think about what you might add with a cover crop residue. Now, I think Amigo is going to talk about many different factors that will influence how much you're actually going to get from that cover crop. Do you incorporate it? Do you leave it standing? Do you leave it on the surface? How long on the surface? There are many different things that will influence it. So what we're capturing now is sort of total maximum. But I would caution you that total maximum is important to calculate, but it is not the bottom line. It is not the end of the story, and I would point out that if you manage as though all of that is there, you're going to find yourself in a probably pretty surprising and disappointing place at the end of the season. So you need to know something about the cover crop that you're putting in order to use this next tab, which shows us, which gives us the ability to plug in. It asks us what % of the cover crop that you planted was a legume. And in the guidance notes that I mentioned in that Word document, it'll give you some more information. So again, I urge you to read that if you want to try to use this. It'll make it a much more valuable experience and the output of it much more meaningful for you. So if you planted a seed mix that was 85% legume, but what came up was only 40% legume, then you really want to put 40% here, not 85%, because it's what's actually in your stand. How tall was the crop when you killed it? And that will give you, the blue boxes calculate an estimated biomass and then an estimated pounds of N. Now there are assumptions that go into the calculations that give you those estimated biomass and estimated pounds of nitrogen. And all of those assumptions are explained down below. They're from a Western SARE document, Managing Cover Crops Profitably. Some reasonable expectations based upon experience. It's an estimate. It's not precise. If you want precise, you need to go out and take a sample, measure the precise nitrogen content of your cover crop, and measure a biomass by taking a very precise sample. And there's directions to do that in the reference that's listed here. But for a rough estimate, this will give you some information. And then, as I said, Amigo will talk a little bit about what of that nitrogen that you're putting in can you anticipate will be in your available for your crop. That number gets entered then here on the spreadsheet. 193 is what we came up with over here. 193 pounds of estimated N from the cover crop is now entered in this spreadsheet. And you can see where it's going. Eventually we'll add up a number of what total added amounts are. What's added in fertilizer? Again, you need to think about what the analysis is of the material. I chose fish emulsion as an example. And you want to think about how much you need to know how much you've applied per acre, what's the analysis of the material, and if it's a liquid, you need to know the density. So in this case, all that information here is highlighted in the red. We pull that information and we put it over here in the fertilizer tab, and we have, we can calculate the amount of N, P2O5, and K2O that are added in each application of that fish emulsion. Now, if you do it every 2 weeks or every week or however often, then you would need to calculate that and add that up to apply. You can put notes here from fertilizer every 2 weeks, so you're putting on 10 pounds every 2 weeks. And then at the bottom, it's going to add up all the nitrogen, the P2O5 and the K2O that you've added, and all of the things that you've entered in the above lines of the spreadsheet. So that's an awful lot of nitrogen. The chances that all of that are A, still there when you put your first seed or transplant in the ground, or B, still there when your crop goes looking for it, are very slim. There's important things to consider, and all of this is outlined in the Word document, and I'm challenged to go through all of it in intense detail today, but I encourage you to read through that because it's where the value comes. Punching the numbers in the spreadsheet won't get you very far unless you consider what they actually mean. So for example, in the case of the soil sample, what was the date taken on the soil sample? Well, it turns out in this example as an illustration, I chose a date where the compost and the cover crop were added and incorporated before the soil sample was taken. So you're not going to count the compost and the cover crop nitrogen additions if you've taken a soil sample after they've been added, because you would end up double counting them, right? So thinking about when you're pulling your sample and what has happened in the time between the time you pulled a sample, a soil sample, and the time you're going to use that information is very, very important. Not only because you may lose or immobilize nitrogen from the system, but you may double count things if you don't consider what's already incorporated in a given number. I hope that's clear. Usually I can look out in an audience and see if people are scratching their heads or kind of following me here. But hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So that adds up all that sort of big picture. Okay, now you got your arms around everything you're putting in the system. Now what are you going to do with that information? If you look at that bottom line for nitrogen, you'd say, holy cow, I'm not adding another ounce, let alone another pound. But if you think about these kinds of questions, when was that nitrogen added? Is it still in an available form when your crop is reaching a rapid vegetative growth stage that it needs a quick available supply of nitrogen? Is it still available at all, or is it completely gone by the time your crop's looking for it? These are important questions to consider. The nitrogen from soil organic matter, again, all of the assumptions that are used to calculate that estimate of N released from soil organic matter are in the document, and you can have a look at them. They're probably reasonable, but there are things that can alter that, right? If the soil conditions, anything that makes microbes unhappy is going to change the rate at which that soil organic matter may be mineralized. Do you have dry periods? Do you have high heat? Do you have waterlogged conditions? All of those things are going to influence it. So your judgment, I like to say to our planners when I'm working with them, we can offer you tools, we can offer you guidance, but you can't check your brain at the door because it's your brain that's bringing value to using all of those tools. And in the case of people who are actually farming, your experience is invaluable, and understanding what's happening in your system. We're using numbers to guide our management decisions. We're measuring to manage, and that's all good, and that does good things for us in many ways, but it does not mean that there isn't room for judgment and an understanding of the nuances of an individual production system, and that's where we're starting to head now. We've ended up in numbers. Now what do we do with those numbers? So there are factors likewise that sort of control how nitrogen is released from compost or manure that may be added or other organic materials that may be added, the cover crops. Anything that requires a biological step to release those nutrients has, I mean, the way I say it to folks who don't have a lot of experience, it works for you guys too, it's a black box, right? So it's going in, and what you're getting out the other side requires a lot more knowledge than simply cranking a number out the other side of that. So thinking that through, I would encourage you, and it's all outlined in that document, think through what might influence the number that you're predicting and whether it might be different based on what you know about what's happening in your system. The plant available nitrogen, PAN, from irrigation water is one that has gotten a lot of attention from the regulatory community. And I should have said at the beginning, and I'll say it here now, clearly we are not regulatory. Anything you ever do with NRCS is 100% confidential. We don't have any agreement to share any information we work with a client on with anybody. It's confidential, it's protected. So I'm not telling you this because it's our interest, but for your own knowledge to understand how much, when you irrigate, typically some of that water is moved down below the root zone before your crop can take it up. So one approach to try to avoid overestimating, particularly in cases where you have high nitrate levels in your irrigation water, to avoid counting that when your plant never has a chance to see it, one approach would be to think about the amount of water that your crop is predicted to use as opposed to the amount of water that you apply. And it walks you through, and I don't have time to do it all here today, it walks you through in the spreadsheet or in the guidance document how you would do that. And the calculations that are showing here on the screen help you understand that. So, but again, it's all written out in the document so you can follow up with it if you want to calculate it for your own operation. You first need to know the number we calculated in the spreadsheet, how much nitrogen went on with the irrigation water. And then you need to find the evapotranspiration rate for your crop, which you can do. The website is there. And then you figure, okay, well, they're estimating that the crop only probably used about 25 acre inches of water. So only a fraction of what I put on probably was transpired by the crop, and so probably a more reasonable estimate of the nitrogen that crop saw from the irrigation water was about 78 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So that's an approach that Tim Hartz and some of the extension folks have been working with, and it makes sense. It's basically based upon what the crop likely transpired as opposed to what water went past the root zone of the crop. So then the next step is figuring out, we've sort of summarized what are the inputs. I'm going to leave Amigo to talk about some of the availability factors from a lot of the organic sources, because he's had a significant amount of experience in that very colorful, long history. It was a great description of Amigo's past. So I'm going to let him talk more about that, and I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of resources to guide you to the sort of the last step. So I've talked about the inputs, and I've offered you a framework that you could use to plug in a summary of what your inputs are in your system, and then thinking about, I've given you some thoughts about, okay, now careful when you think about what that all means in terms of assuming what's available for your crops when you want it there. Now the next step is, well, what does my crop need? So most people figure that out. If you're still in business after a year or two, you've figured it out. But whether you figured it out with a big margin of error, buffering yourself from potential over-application or potential under-application by maybe applying a little more than you need, it's hard to figure that out from the returns you get on your production, because unless you're really overdoing it, you may not see any effect. So one source for information is one of the tabs in the worksheet that I've sent you, the Excel worksheet that I've sent you, which offers not all the crops, but I've pulled a bunch of the common veg crops, and then there's a tab for fruit and nut that has just a few of them. But increasingly there's recognition that if we're going to ask producers, farmers, to demonstrate their stewardship, we have to give them some digested, accessible information about what research demonstrates is a reasonable application rate for the major nutrients. And so in these spreadsheets, what I've done is I've given you from the literature, and that's cited on the information source, and those are hot links. So when you open the document, you can click on them and go to them. You'll get to different resources that will tell you where I got these numbers. So in your phosphorus level, for example, in our sheet, we just had the number from the soil test, and that's usually, depending on where you're farming, you're either looking at the Olsen P or the Bray P. If the pH is higher, you're in Olsen. If pH is lower, you're in Bray. I've used Olsen here because this was initially developed here in the Salinas area, and that's what most of our soils are, higher pH. So you want to compare your number to the number that's listed as sort of a sufficiency level. If you've got this much, the likelihood of getting a response to more fertilizer is not very high. So you want to compare your phosphorus level to the sufficiency level, and the same concept applies with potassium. Numbers are quite different, as you can see, so you want to make sure, and it depends on the crop. Some crops are heavier K feeders or P feeders or N feeders than others, so you want to know your crop, and it's important to match it to the crop specific guidance. So that's one source, is the tabs in the web in the spreadsheet. Another source is another Word document that I sent you that has, again, a series of hot links. I've found, this is what I have thus far found, and I welcome your input, of best ways to get people to the abundant plethora of resources that already exist out there from a wide range of sources to help provide the kind of guidance that I just described to help achieve best management outcomes. So what I've done in this Word document is just a couple sentences explaining what's there, and then a hot link that will take you directly to that website. So you can find information for various crops, and we had a slight glitch that I can't click on this and take you there, but Jesse was kind enough to set me up so I can. So for example, take you to a few through sort of a back door. If you were to click on this link right below Fertility Management Guidance via FREP, that's the Fertilizer Research Education Program through the California Department of Food and Agriculture. If you were to click on that on your own computer, it would take you to this website that you should see now. And so for example, suppose you're growing broccoli. You can click on broccoli, and it will take you through a whole range of information from pre-plant all the way through harvest, looking at soil test, looking at leaf analysis, your pre-plant end, and each one you hover over will give you some detailed information on that. You can do that for all. They have a number of crops. They have cotton, walnut, processing tomatoes, and they're adding all of these that you see pictured they have. This has been put together by a postdoc who has been charged to find all the literature that's relevant and summarize it in user-friendly form. And it's a pretty user-friendly website, I find. It's not yet covering everything we need because it takes him a long time to find and evaluate all the research, but he's adding continuously as he finds more. The next one you might look at is a different one that I'll pull from that same Word doc, is various information from the UC system. You can go by crop, and it'll take you to the various crops, and you can find, I don't know, what do we want to look at? Cilantro. So we look at cilantro. You can find this production information bulletin, and there are these kinds of bulletins for many, many of the common crops in California. The harder ones to find are some of the less common crops, but you can find information. There is information out there. And it'll go through all kinds of basic information for the given crop and really sort of step you through basic considerations and give you something to hang your hat on when you justify, this is why I'm applying this, this is why this is the right amount, or, oh, maybe I am a little low on that, maybe I could do better if I had a little bit more PK, whatever. Sometimes you need information that you may not have for your crop. For example, when you're trying to calculate how much water is applied, I have found that often people don't have a quantitative measure of how much water they put on. They don't know how many acre inches. They know they water every other day in hot weather, windy weather, or they monitor they water when they note that the soil is drying down. But they don't have a volume of water applied. And so one way to get that information, you can get an estimate using the UC cost and return studies. So you can pull up, they have an awful lot of them. You want to be in the right region. But say you're growing cabbage, you can go and see what they've done for cabbage. Well, they've got a cabbage in South Coast Ventura. So it may not be close enough for comfort for you to use those numbers, but it'll give you ballpark information to start to think about. What they do is they go through all of the estimated costs, which means that they have to quantify each of the inputs, including things like water. A lot of it is sort of chemical inputs, which don't apply perhaps quite as much for some of you, but they certainly do have all the information, the tillage operations, everything. So I think with that, I want to pause and let Jessie decide how she wants to handle questions. Do you want to wait till the end, or do you want to take a couple now and then move on?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. There are a couple of questions that have come in while you've been presenting, so I think we'll just take a moment to address those. If other folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box on the right-hand side and or the question and answer box. We can see both of them. So, Karen, we had a question about how these types of tools work for seasonality, so seasonal nitrogen management plans rather than year over.
That's a great question. You could do it you can set your own time scale. I don't think that I don't think that it's necessarily geared towards year over at all. If you want to pull a sample more frequently, the bottom line is understanding what you're putting in and when you think it's going to be there. But I have been talking to some of our planners about doing more frequent post-season testing to get a better sense of what you're leaving behind. And that's something that if you're doing quick seasons, might be worth doing. If you mean one crop cycle, is that what the questioner was maybe thinking?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think that what we've just presented necessarily only works for a year long. That said, you would want to consider any carryover if you're going to plant more than once, and you're managing. You probably you may, for example, apply compost only once, but then cycle a couple crops through it. So you want to think through what's there by the time you're coming around for your second or your third planting.
And then another question we had, Karen, is can alfalfa fines be used as a top dressing to add nitrogen to hay fields?
Good question. I will just confess I don't have direct experience in that, and I'd rather not flap my gums without knowledge of it. But it's a great question. I'd invite the person to follow up with me, and I can find some information on it, and happy to discuss it. My email is there.
All right, thanks so much, Karen. And there was somebody who had their hand up, but we managed to click on it and have it no longer show. So if there was if somebody wanted to ask a verbal question, you are all unmuted. So whoever wanted to ask that can ask it now. Or maybe not. All right, so moving on. Amigo, we're going to move on to your section now. So you can take it away.
Well, thanks, Jesse. Well, first I want to say, Karen, that was a great presentation. I learned a whole bunch. Thank you so much. And I look forward to trying to dovetail into what you had to say. And I thank Jesse and CCOF for inviting me to be I'm a virgin to doing a webinar, so we're going to learn how to do this together. And I don't have the technical skills, apparently, to know how to fast or forward it, so Jesse's going to do that for us. So actually what I want to focus on is how to optimize the nitrogen. The cost of nitrogen, organic nitrogen, is so expensive, and typically seems to be an underutilized resource. We all know that we need it, but then how to maximize it is what I'm going to focus on. So this is some of the foundation principles. So we do know that organic matter and humus drives this whole process, and we're topping off the tank with fertilizers, but effectively, the better we manage organic matter and the decayed process, which creates humus, the aerobic microbial activity, nitrogen fixation, those are the keys, in my mind, to growing successful organic crops. And at the same time, minimizing your off-farm inputs. And I think our goal in general should be to try and figure out how to do as much of this utilizing the natural biological cycle and minimizing inputs both from an ecological and an economic reasoning. So what I want to talk about is maximizing the nitrogen from cover crops, compost manures, the protein-based fertilizers, and microbial activity to provide the greatest growth and yield response with the lowest expense and least environmental damage. Next, please. So just a quick overview. Most of you know all these things, but I just want to say what nitrogen's values are. It's essential for protein formation, and it's an essential component of amino acids which create the proteins, or portions of the protein. There's 18 essential amino acids. Nitrogen is implicated in 2 of those. Photosynthesis, the rapid growth, and of course the leaf and cell development. So obviously a nitrogen deficiency inhibits any of these issues. It's responsible for probably the key element that most people use to ensure higher yields. It's deficient in virtually all soils, and even the best of soils, people apply it. And there are 4 common forms of nitrogen found in all soils, and they vary and they rapidly change. And as Karen was mentioning earlier in her presentation, it's hard to actually predict these nitrogen cycles and their forms with either a soil or a tissue test, but we do know that all these forms are in the soil and they migrate back and forth, most of them affected by biological activity and oxygen. So what we're trying to do is maximize that activity to convert the organically bound and microbially bound forms, the carbon-based ones, into the nitrates and the ammonia forms that plant utilize, and minimize the formation of nitrites and nitrous oxide, both of which nitrites leach, as well as nitrates, as well as, I just lost the screen. I hope it's going to come back here in a second. Oh, hold on a second. Just happened with my computer. There it is. Sorry about that. Most plant species, well, they rapidly change, as I said. Most plant species preferentially feed on nitrate or the microbial forms of nitrogen, so that's what we're going to focus on here. Next. So the microbial activity regulates the forms of nitrogen no matter the source of the nitrogen that you applied, with the exception being foliars and fertigation. They somewhat go around the microbial phenomena, but particularly any soil applied or carbon-based fertilizers or composts or cover crops are their release rate and the form that's available to the plants driven by microbial activity. So the release rate of the nitrogen to the plant's root, soil, and water is regulated by these bugs, and predominantly what we're looking for is to maximize the aerobic biological activity, because it's the aerobic species that are the most prevalent in reducing and converting and releasing nitrogen into the forms that plants utilize. And microbial activity is affected by lots of different factors: water, lack of or excess, ammonia can affect biological activity, and oxygen deficiencies. Those are common, and they reduce nitrogen availability, and they alter that nitrogen form into those non-desirable forms like nitrous oxide or nitrites. And this anaerobic phenomena increases the denitrification and the loss of the nitrogen to ammonia or nitrite. So what we try to do to maximize organic systems is to maximize the aerobic process, and we'll talk about that next. So some of the things that affect biological activity include the soil temperature. As soil temperatures go down, microbial activity decreases. Therefore, we become more reliant upon fertility inputs, whereas when soil temperatures increase, biological activity releases more of the nitrogen, and therefore you need less fertilizers. This is important. Someone asked a question about nitrogen budgeting year-round. Soil temperature and day length drive this process dramatically about biological activity. So if you have cool soil temperatures or short wintertime day length situations, no matter what's going on, the biological activity is going to be reduced, aerobic or anaerobic, and therefore it's going to change and slow the process of biological decay. The CN ratio, both of what's in the soil naturally plus what you apply, has a huge impact on this decay process. If you supply a material that's high in carbon and low in nitrogen, the biology ties up the nitrogen until it decays a majority of the carbon into the forms that the plants can use. And moisture and oxygen regulate the process. So excess, as I mentioned, could create an anaerobic environment, or a lack of moisture actually limits biological development and therefore the decay process. And oxygen is all tied to this, whether things turn out aerobic or anaerobic. Interesting thing which we see in lots of agricultural situations is the problems associated with too much nitrogen. And although it's more common with conventional fertilizers, which are soluble and readily available, I regularly work with this problem in crops and find that we get excess, which stimulates pests and diseases, particularly the sucking insects, aphids and such. They thrive on that kind of high nitrogen conditions. And this is from a phenomenon known as free amino acids and also cellular density. I don't really have the time to talk about here, but there are a lot of science behind this. This is essentially when the plant's manufacturing or absorbing excess nitrates, it creates an environment that's attractive to numerous kinds of species of insects and diseases. I also might want to stop here for a moment and say that this issue of maximizing nitrogen is probably more critical for a rapidly growing annual crop than, say, a perennial orchard or a berry crop. And so what I'm talking about here is maximizing it for these rapid, heavy nitrogen-using crops. You may not need to utilize all those techniques if you're growing perennials. Probably don't need to utilize them. They don't need as much nitrogen. Some of the other effects of nitrogen includes delayed ripening, increases cold damage, increases water uptake, which that causes water loss in storage, and poor storage reduces the overall nutrition, shortens the shelf life, reduces the flavor, reduces trace minerals and phytonutrients. So it's important to have adequate nitrogen, but an excess can create some increasingly important problems. Then increasing the biological activity with digested organic matter and humus from compost and legumes is the best way to increase soil nitrogen levels. And what I mean by that is that there are lots of ways to do that, but if you're maximizing your soil's biological activity through the decay of organic matter into humus, you're going to get your biggest bang for your buck from nitrogen, as well as your greatest increase in biology with the least expense. Next, please. So then, you know, you need to get to know your fertilizers if you're going to apply them because they vary widely in their carbon to nitrogen ratio. So plants basically pick up nitrogen out of soils at about a 12-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So 12 parts carbon, 1 nitrogen. Organic materials run from very low, under 12-to-1, you know, 5, 6-to-1 on the soluble liquid materials, to as high, depending on the material, you might have 200-to-1 CN ratio. That 201 materials can take a long time to break down and become available. So knowing not just the total nitrogen of the fertilizer, but its actual carbon to nitrogen ratio is really useful. Also the form of nitrogen, since there's multiple forms of it, and again, the carbon-bound forms require biology to break them down, the solubility, and then the crop availability and microbial activity availability. So most fertilizers, organic ones, are microbial, animal, or plant-based, or combinations. There's lots of products on the market now. Carbon complex nitrogen fertilizers generally have low levels of nitrate or ammonia. There are some exceptions, but predominantly most of those are complexed into forms that are carbon-based and broken down by biology. And that CN ratio determines the rate of plant availability. So if you have a crop that's a slow-growing crop, like or doesn't require a lot of nitrogen, you could get away with a higher CN ratio of an input, but you have to be careful with that with crops that are rapid growing. And it's hard to predict the release rate, for sure, and they're expensive. So these are reasons we're trying to minimize using fertilizers. Although typically every farm I work on needs some supplemental nitrogen fertilizers, we try to minimize that. Next, please. So some of the ways to assess it, many of you are aware of these: color, texture of the plant tissue, the leaf and the plant size, pest and disease damage. You can also smell ammonia when you have excess, or actually say anaerobic, not aerobic, anaerobic odors. And then you can also do these tests with soil nitrate and organic matter tests, leaf laboratory or on-farm petiole analysis, and nitrate meters, and refractometers. I'm going to talk a little bit about those as time allows. Next. So here are some of the ways, the basic things that I've learned and others about how to maximize nitrogen from your inputs. So if you use legumes, or in fact if you have grains or grasses growing, if you want to maximize their nitrogen availability, you incorporate them into the soil. You don't leave them on the surface. You incorporate them in the soil so that they get contact with soil and microbes and air and water, and you do so at or about full bloom. That's when the nitrogen concentration of the tissue is at its maximum and the CN ratio is closest. Anything you go past full bloom, the carbon content increases, the nitrogen goes down. It can take longer for it to break down. That might be adequate if, again, in an orchard, but in a vegetable or a fast-growing annual crop situation, you'd want something that broke down rapidly. So approximately full bloom, earlier if you have to, but the later you go past bloom, your CN ratio goes up. If you add essential or extra digester microbes, we'll talk about it a bit, we'll speed up that process because they're going to be hungry and want to eat the carbon and nitrogen and release it out of the organic material. The finer it's shredded, the quicker it breaks down. There's more surface area. The more surface area there is of material, the quicker microbes can colonize it. So big chunky stuff takes a lot longer than little fine materials. So mowing is typically a good idea when you're doing a cover crop, when you incorporate it. And then tilling it shallow. There are some exceptions to that with spaders where you can get away putting them fairly deep in the ground because the oxygen is saturated to the depth of the spader. But with most equipment that people have, rototillers or discs, you're better off having it near the surface where there's more air. That's going to cause a quicker breakdown. Then you use the close and low nitrogen or CN ratio materials as you apply it. So if you have a high CN product, compost, manure, or fertilizers can take longer. Also place these materials near the surface where there's more air. And if you want to stimulate that process, if you cultivate it, do a shallow cultivation to add oxygen, and you will stimulate biological activity and that release rate. And then you can fertigate with these digested liquid fertilizers, which have close CN ratios, or you can add additional materials like compost tea, or that lab is an abbreviation for lactobacillus, one of the cultures people make to basically break down organic matter faster, and that's something people do on farm and are low cost. Moisture management is clearly important. You get too much rainfall, you know what that does, drives out fertility, but also irrigation can do the same thing. And maintaining that moisture in the top 6 inches where the maximum amount of air is where you're going to get your maximum biological activity. And then you can increase it if you need to on top of that with foliar feeding or fertigation. Next. So the CN ratio, as I mentioned earlier, is key to this process. So humus and the biological mass are the primary natural sources in soils, and then we're supplementing that in organic systems. But until the CN ratio gets to approximately 12:1, whatever you've added or whatever's present in the soil is not going to be available as nitrogen until that carbon part of the fraction gets broken down by the carbon digesting microbes. So this 12:1 CN ratio is critical. That's where plants, and there's some variations on species, but approximately in that range, and you can see different science saying 10:1, 15:1, but someplace in that range of 12:1 is where you get your max biological or release of nitrogen. So as it gets higher, then as carbon nitrogen gets broken down, it becomes available. Above 12:1, the nitrogen gets bound up until it gets broken down, and below 8:1, you get nitrate leaching, and this is a problem associated with predominantly conventional nitrogen fertilizers because they're such low CN. In fact, usually they have no carbon in them. But even organic fertilizers, particularly the liquid ones, if you use them in large amounts, they're going to leach. And so we want to minimize that, as we know the regulatory process is driving that issue. And also, if we minimize leaching, we maximize the effect and the cost value of the materials. Next. So this is an example of carbon to nitrogen ratio of a material. I was at a job not that long ago, and these people had spread what they believed was a valuable input in the form of a partly composted woody material. And you can see both by the texture and the size of these materials and the color, this is predominantly carbon, very little nitrogen. And when this is turned into the soil, this is going to take a huge amount of time to break down, robbing all the surplus nitrogen out of the soil to feed the microbes to do the digestion process. So this is putting this soil in reverse as far as nitrogen availability, and we want to avoid that by utilizing materials that are fully broken down and particle sizes that are smaller and optimizing the environment. Next, please. So legumes are one of the ways to do that. Green, lush material here growing in an apple orchard. These are bell beans. These are right at that beginning, not quite full bloom, but at the beginning of the blooming stage. They're almost maximized their nitrogen. Those are about 6-foot-tall bell beans. It's a lot of biomass. And if it's handled correctly, will quickly release the nitrogen to the crop. Now, in the case of this apple orchard, we didn't want to give it as much nitrogen, so we actually mowed it and left it on the surface for quite a while in order to sort of slow the process of nitrogen release. But in a vegetable cropping or annual cropping system, you'd want to get this into the ground green and lush. Next, please. So, some conversations about cover crops. So they're on-farm source. You can raise your own seed or you can buy it inexpensively, and it supplies all these important components, and including attracting in the good bugs that suppress pests and weed suppression and nutrients. Typically grown in rotations with annual crops, but also are commonly interplanted with perennials. And there's many, many species now available, and you've got a choice of annuals or biennials or perennials depending on your cropping system. Next. This is some idea of some of the nitrogen fixation potential for legumes. As you'll notice, there's a wide range of nitrogen fixing from the low end to the high end, and that is affected by your soil biology and the soil nutrition. So on the low end, those are biologically inefficient soils, or they have some nutrient deficiency or a pH imbalance. And at the upper end, those are ones that are maximize the nitrogen fixation potential of the legume. Next, please. And you can see that it can be almost double the difference. So in the case of soybeans, there's a 10-fold increase in nitrogen from the lowest. This is all research documents that I found. That you can just get a huge variation. And so I'm going to talk next about how to maximize this, but just the fact that growing a legume doesn't ensure that you're going to have these numbers, the higher numbers, which obviously if we're going to do this, we're trying to maximize their effect. Next. So these usually conditions to maximize nitrogen fixation and legume growth. Of course, getting the right species and variety, there's a wide range in that. If you're not familiar, you should do some trials. Oftentimes we'll put 5 or 6 varieties of the same species in a site to figure out what's the best varieties or combination of varieties for the site. The planting date, huge range and impact on the growth of crops. I've seen triple and quadruple the amount of biomass of the same seeds or the same mixtures of seeds planted 30 days apart. The first mixture was planted at the right time, got off, especially in fall, got off to a good growth process before it cooled down. Something planted a month later, virtually no growth. So date is important, and that is experimental. You need to figure out what's best in your site, but particularly for winter leguminous plants, they need to grow and you get going when the soil temperature is still adequate for germination and initial growth. Your seeding rate and depth, obviously if you plant them too deep or get too little seed, you're not going to get maximum growth. Soils that are rich in phosphorus, calcium, and sulfur are the 3 most important elements for legumes to grow to maximum nitrogen fixation. If you're deficient in any of these 3, addressing those elements will increase the nitrogen fixation by the legume, and in trace mineral boron is also very important for nitrogen fixation, and molybdenum. Using the correct strain of rhizobium bacteria, just want to make a couple comments about that quickly. Not only is it has to be the right strain, because the species of rhizobium that provide the nitrogen fixation process with the legume as a host on its roots are species specific, so you make sure you have the right one. And also, I just ran into this problem again, much of the nitrogen inoculants sold on the market are dead when you get them because people do not handle them correctly at the dealerships or where they're located, unfortunately. They should be refrigerated, at least till you get them. They should be refrigerated. If they're not, they die. And you can check that with a simple microscope if you want to find that out. But if you're not getting someone that's handling it correctly, what you're going to end up with is essentially dead inoculant. Once you have dead inoculant, you have nothing going for you. So make sure that it's alive and it's the right species. All right, let's turn that phone down. My apologies. So then adequate moisture and growth during the germination growth stage. Moisture is essential. Light, and then again growing it till the early pod forming stage, or just at full bloom, right in that range there. Next, please, Jesse. So these are these nodules we're trying to maximize. Next, please. So here's some tips to getting that maximum nitrogen from the inoculation process. The correct species, fresh product. Yeah, oftentimes people use material that's old, it's dated. These are living bugs living in that, usually peat moss blend that you get. Protected from heat. Don't leave these laying out in the pickup truck. I put them in the refrigerator and buy it from someone who refrigerates them. If they don't, you're just wasting your money. Double the rate, especially on the first time you used it in a field. These bacteria have to colonize these freshly developed roots. If there's low population of them, you do not get full colonization. You don't get as much nitrogen fixation. Use milk. Milk actually sticks it better and provides some nutrition. If you want to do pelleting, turns out soft rock phosphate is a great pelleting material, and there's a primer on how to do pelleting. I can't go into that today, but and then inoculated and planted immediately. That bacteria is sunlight sensitive and heat sensitive. You need to get it into the soil and cover it ASAP, and inoculate with the same species in the same field for at least 2 different times when you plant it. After that period of time, typically then you have these microbes living in high population in the field. You don't need to keep doing it. And then you select the most vigorous plants for your home brewed inoculant. Basically, I'll show you that a little bit more in a moment. So, but you can actually create your own inoculant by looking for the plants that have the most nodules, pink or red. Next picture, please. And the next one, I think it's a better. Yeah. So what you're looking for here, this is the pink color that looks a little bit like raw meat, is what you want to look for when you look at legume nodules. on the roots themselves. If they're yellow or white, those are not nitrogen-fixing bacteria nodules. They need to be pink, that's the same, it's hemoglobin, the same as what's in your blood. So you want to look for as much of this nodulization, that is as many of them as possible, and them being pink in color on the inside when you break them open. When you find that, then those are the maximum nitrogen fixers. Next slide, please. And then if you want to do this for your own production, selecting them, you select the biggest legumes in the field at full bloom, dig up the roots in the soil, mix the soil and nodules with equal parts water, sugar rather. So you basically are going to store this, excuse me. Sorry about that. You're going to store, losing my voice. Sorry. Hopefully it comes back. So you look for the biggest legumes, you dig up the roots, you look for the nodules, you mix those nodules with sugar, you store it, and then you use that as your home brewed inoculant. You'll get much more nitrogen fixation in subsequent years. And you do that year after year, you have higher populations of microbes. Next slide, please.
So, Amigo, while you're taking another drink there, we do have a question coming in, a hand raised from Matt. And Matt, let's see if we can, we're going to unmute you right now, and if you want to ask Amigo your question. Hopefully. All right. We'll sit, while Matt is figuring out his audio, we have another question that kind of goes along with this section, Amigo. What's the best cool weather legume to fix nitrogen?
Well, it's typically a blend, but in the cool weather, typically are the vetches and the bell beans. Those are probably the two highest. I can go on now. Again, I'm not going to have a very good voice, but I'll do what I can. So just to recognize that the majority of the nitrogen is in the top of the plant. If you don't get the top in the ground, you're not getting the maximum nitrogen. Very little of it in most species is in the roots. So incorporation is critical to maximizing the nitrogen. Next, please. And then these are some of the ways to maximize that nitrogen release. Incorporate at full bloom, shred it completely, add extra microbes, incorporate it into moist soil, or irrigate it if it's not moist. It's better off if you go into moist soil. That will avoid nitrogen loss. Use a spader preferentially. Most farms don't have those, but a disc or rototol. But do it enough passes so that you get all the organic matter in the ground. If it's laying on the surface, you're losing it to the air as nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. Shallow cultivate 1 to 2 times after 3 to 5 days to increase that oxygen. It's like making a compost pile. Keep the soil moist and allow 7 to 14 days for decomposition, and you're ready to plant. Next, please. And then I'm just going to cycle through these quickly. Fall planted legumes. Next. That's vetch planted on top of a bed. Easy to manage, easy to incorporate, rapid growth, good weed suppression. Next. That's vetch planted with oats because vetch will grow bigger if you have something for it to climb up on. It's viney. Next. That's bell beans. Next. Another species of vetch in bloom. Next. Peas. There's a lot of varieties of peas that are good nitrogen fixers. They're also marketable, which is a good bonus. Next. Warm weather legumes. These are some other species you can try the times of the year. Next slide. Cowpeas, great cover crop, easy to grow, low water use, lots of nitrogen fixation, loves the heat. Next. That's what they look like at maturity. You would, again, not typically grow them to maturity for cover crop, but you could also save them for seed or sell them. Next. Crotalaria or sun hemp, a fantastic legume, underutilized. I'm kind of surprised not grown more. This can get 6 to 8 feet tall in about 90 days and make a huge amount of nitrogen. Next. There's all kinds of beans in general. Virtually all species of beans are nitrogen fixing and warm weather loving. Next. Now I'll talk about compost. There's a lot more to say about cover crops. There's a lot of resources online, but we've got to skip through that as we're running out of time. Compost, next slide. Next one, please. So it can be a good source of nitrogen, but it's often slow release for rapid crops. too slow, which then requires supplementation. If you want to get the maximum nitrogen from the from the compost, you've got to get a CN ratio close as you can to 10 to 1. The total nitrogen is not as important as the CN ratio for quick availability. Typically, manure composts have lower CN ratios, not always, but usually. And the compost needs to be mature as possible to increase the availability. Next. The finer texture it is, the quicker it releases. If you want it quick, then screen it. If you're not worried about that, well, we'll put it on nice and chunky. Keep it near the surface. Don't want it to dry out. Apply it before planting a cover crop will actually increase its effect rather than after the cover crop. And it takes multiple years, which will increase these various factors over time. Next. Protein-based nitrogen sources. So first, these, the compost and the cover crop, I believe, are the first most important things to use. But then these are these supplemental forms that you would add in to top things off. Most of them are animal proteins. Some of them are vegetable. And some of them have multiple purpose. For example, like mustard meal not only is a fertility agent, but it also has a biocidal effect and can kill off soil pathogens and nematodes. So depending on what you're looking for, you have lots of choices. Also, there's a wide range in that CN ratio, and total nitrogen. You need to get to know those materials. Typically, the protein-based materials are slow release or medium release. They're not the faster cycled ones because there's more carbon in them. They need that biology to break them down. And their release rate is dependent on these factors that I show you here: CN ratio, particle size, your depth, texture, temperature, day length, moisture, oxygen, activity, biological activity, and time. Aerobic biology does the degradation process, as I mentioned before, and moisture and oxygen are essential for this process to work. So same rules as would be for compost or the cover crops. Next. Some of the ways to increase that process: get the soil temperature up. You can do that by tilling the soil, by covering it with plastic or row covers. Anything you can do there to increase that temperature will speed that release rate. The finer the particle size is. So if it's micronized or finely ground, or it's digested like a microbially digested liquid, is going to release its nitrogen more quickly. Keep it near the surface because, again, oxygen is the driving process of the breakdown process. Incorporate it to put it in contact with the microbes. If you put protein-based fertilizers on the surface, they're going to more slowly release than if they're even mixed an inch into the ground. So side dressing is better than top dressing. Or if you top dress, cultivate on top of it to put some soil on it. And then adding additional microbes at that point is also useful to speed that release process. Next. So CN ratio, same story as I mentioned earlier. It's key. If you don't know your CN ratio of what you're working with, then you're limiting yourself in maximizing the nitrogen release rate. Same set of rules. Next. So just give some idea of the CN ratio. Now these are ranges, and you can't hold yourself to exactly, alfalfa 16 to 1 or 20 to 1, or chicken manure 7 to 1, but this gives you some idea of some of the ranges that you find in different materials. Next slide, please. Just to point out some of these problematic ones like wood chips, 767 parts of carbon to 1 nitrogen. That's going to take forever to release itself, or sawdust. Raw sawdust at 500 to 1. Even rotted sawdust is 200 to 1. Newspaper, 600 to 1. So if you put those things in a compost pile, you have a chance to break them down so your nitrogen release rate is more rapid. But putting them on directly is going to ask for trouble. Next slide, please. Compost tea, I'm going to mention these quickly because we're running out of time. These are ways to increase biological activity if they're properly made. You can increase the release rate of nitrogen. They have antifungal and bacterial impacts. They stimulate nutrient uptake. Sometimes they can increase yields, and people use them as a foliar, a fertigation, or as a drench. And some people add additional nitrogen sources to them to increase their availability. Next. Then there's the animal manure-based fertilizers, the guanos, the chicken pellets, and animal manure itself. Again, contains a mixture of these different nitrogen sources, and the CN ratio goes all over the board. And again, that's going to affect your nitrogen release rate. And again, same set of rules, biologically active soil, micronized material, low CN ratio, side dressed or pre-plant cultivated in the top of the bed is going to increase that release. Next. If you leave it on the surface, you're going to lose nitrogen as ammonia or nitrous oxide. And the quicker you get any of these products into the ground, the more nitrogen you're going to get out of them. Cold soils are going to release it slower. Warm soils are going to increase it. If you compost it, unless composted or it's heat treated and human pathogen free, then these materials in organic systems are treated as raw manures, which require a 120 or more day interval between application and crop harvest. So that's why many people get them heat treated or compost them to speed up that process so they can harvest quicker. You need to be careful with manures directly out of the animal. They're often much higher in ammonia, and they are a mild biocide when applied into soils. And then also manure can contain these soil, plant, and human pathogens or weed seeds, all of which you can mitigate or eliminate through composting. Next. Then there's the liquid organic fertilizers. These are the common ones on the market. There seems to be more and more of them every day. And they vary, and there are ones that are higher than 4% on the market as well. Those are more regulated. Some of this is in the nitrate form. Some of it's in the organic fraction. Take a look at the product, and it should tell you on the label what portion of it's in the nitrate form and what portion is in the organic fraction. And again, remember that the nitrate form is going to be most quickly taken. But these are typically have low CN ratios. So for that reason alone, even if they're in the organic nitrogen or organic carbon-bound form, they're going to be fairly rapidly uptake, and the nitrate forms are very rapid. They have a short-term effect, and they're definitely leachable. You can drive them right out of the root zone with too much water, and they're expensive. They work. People love them, but they're pricey. And people use them in all those three ways noted at the bottom. Next. Next slide, please. Just a typical injector. Next. Going past these things. This one's no longer an issue, I guess. We finally regulated this one out of existence. I think that was a mistake, but I'll just go by this one next. And then this is kind of a final wrap-up again of this whole conversation. Okay, if you want to increase the nitrogen availability, maximize it, you use your legumes at their proper time, you add extra microbes, you shred them finely, you keep them shallow tilled, make sure it's moist, till it again if you need more oxygen, more release rate, you want to speed that process up. Use low CN ratio compost manures or fertilizers. Again, if you're growing an orchard crop, that might not be so critical, but if you're something that you want maximum growth in a rapid growing crop, get that CN ratio down as close as you can. Keep them shallow so there's oxygen available and moisture. Cultivate them to add more oxygen and stimulate microbial activity. Fertigate with extra liquid nitrogen fertilizers, preferably digested ones, or compost tea or lactobacillus. Avoid over-irrigation. Maintain the moisture in the top 6 inches for maximum aerobic release. And foliar feed or fertigate as needed as a supplement. And I believe that's it. Yeah, that's the last slide.
All right. Thank you so much, Amigo. There are a bunch of different questions, and I know we're coming close to time here, but I'd like to give some space to the question and answer section at the end, so we may go a little bit over time here. So, Amigo, in your presentation, you described a low CNN ratio. What would you count as a low CNN ratio?
A low one, well, plants optimized uptake is about 12 to 1. So anything that approximates 12 to 1, we're on the low side. Now, you have some materials like the liquid organic fertilizers. They're even below 12 to 1. They can be as low as I think I saw one that was 5 to 1. So that's 5 parts carbon, 1 part nitrogen. But what you're trying to avoid is the stuff that's up at the 100 CN to 1 or 50 or 60. Those things just take a lot longer to break down. So approximately 10 to 1, 12 to 1 is low.
Thank you. And what kind of cover crop would you recommend for a desert area near in Arizona, sandy soil, poor in organic matter, and low rain? Grains or legumes or other?
Well, I would say that would be dependent on whether you need more nitrogen. If you're looking for a nitrogen source, then I would look at legumes. cowpeas have done exceptionally well, and crotalaria, or also known as sun hemp, do well in sandy, hot climates. Also, lab was the plant I didn't show there, is also used in hot climates. And if you can find it, pigeon pea, which is kind of a rare seed these days, but they were historically a common desert crop. In fact, there was a lot of trials on that in Arizona back in the 1920s. But I don't see that seed around much anymore. But I think what's off the shelf, easy to get these days, hot climate, is cowpeas. Now, they're going to need some irrigation, but they're not water hogs. So I would look at that. Oh, and by the way, cowpeas have their own species of inoculum. They are not a true pea. So if you buy cowpeas, make sure you get the inoculant specifically for a cowpea, not for peas, which is different.
Another question, and this was brought up earlier in the presentation, Amigo, about alfalfa fines being used as a top dressing to add nitrogen for hay fields. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, they are. Alfalfa fines has a relatively high amount of nitrogen, so it would supply nitrogen, although, again, the challenge is going to be if it's top dressed, a portion of that's going to get lost into the air. It's not going to be as 100% efficient, but it would supply some fertility. It just wouldn't be as much as if you incorporated it. Also, there's an interesting thing about alfalfa. There is a growth hormone that's in alfalfa that, when applied to other crops, stimulates their growth. So even if it doesn't give a substantial amount of nitrogen, you may get a response based on the growth hormonal effect.
Thank you. So another question, in a perennial grass hay system, do you have a recommendation for a good legume to add in the fall and or the winter?
Perennial grass hay system. Well, it depends on the location. I guess I'd have to qualify that one based on the climate. There are numerous kinds of clovers. I would start with the various taller clovers, the red clovers, the rose clover. Also, there are a couple of different kinds of alfalfas that people have successfully intercropped with grasses. So I would start with those first. Those are the most likely. Perennial alfalfas is one choice. If you're limited on rainfall, there are also annual species that you would fall plant. They would grow into the spring and then die out after they made seed.
Thank you. We also have a question about the best nitrogen source or most ideal for foliar feeding of grapes.
Yeah, you know, I think that there's a lot of choices there. I think the digested fish materials, the corn steep liquor materials, those are both really successful. People have used them for a lot. And although one I didn't mention because it's relatively new to me, I'm getting some really good response with these amino acid materials that are made off of soy products. There's a couple of products out there that are both dry and or liquid that at pretty low rates are been doing remarkably good, and I've been using them on grapes with good success. So I would look at all of those materials.
And a more broad-ranging question that was written in earlier in the session, can you talk about how to create a cost-effective plan? Many of these things seem like they'd be on the expensive side. What would be your recommendation for creating a nitrogen plan that's cost-effective?
Well, the least costly system that I can see in most crops is growing legumes. Now, not every crop, because if your water costs are really high or you don't have the advantage of having winter or seasonal rainfall, that becomes more of an economic issue. But if you're talking about a single input that has the most nitrogen and organic matter for the least investment, it's clearly a leguminous crop, hands down. After that, then compost, and preferentially on-farm made compost, because you can make a better product yourself than what you can buy. Even if you haven't done it before, you can almost without trying, you can make a better product than what's typically on the market. Most of what's on the market is not very high quality. And with a little bit of practice, you can make it. And if you can source local materials inexpensively, then that's the least expensive input after legume seed. Also, I should mention, if you grow your own legumes and save your seed, then your cost of seed is dramatically reduced. So the cost per acre is least. And then relying on these protein-based or sidebar materials as a supplement only instead of as the standalone fertilizer would be an improvement.
Got it. Well, thank you, Amigo. That seems to be the end of the questions that we've got coming in here. If folks have additional questions, they can feel free to email us, and I'll route those to the correct places. Just as a public service announcement, the ag waiver requirements that Karen mentioned earlier in her presentation are coming into effect. Here's a link with information in it. Again, this will be in the presentation, and you all get the presentation via email just after we're done. And there's some contact information if you have questions about the water monitoring requirements that are coming into effect in all of California. I know some of you are in other places, so it will be different for non-California residents, but the majority of you are here. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate the time and energy it took, I'm sure, to get on the webinar. There's going to be a little evaluation form which is going to pop up after you exit the webinar. Would appreciate if you just take a moment and fill that out for us. There's more educational trainings coming up. You can check them out on our website. The next one we have is Breaking into Retail, meant for small processors and handlers, farm-based processors as well, about how to get into creative retail markets. If you're interested in certification, you're not currently certified organic, you can call Coach Jane Wade. She's our kind of organic specialist as far as how to get you certified and what you're going to need to get in line to make that happen. And this is her contact information. And if you have additional questions about the presentation, feel free to give me a call or give me an email. Again, you will get all of this, a video copy of the presentation, a PDF of the presentation materials, all of the materials referenced by Karen that were sent on Friday. And if you have additional questions, feel free to get in touch. Thank you so much for joining us on the webinar. We really appreciate your presence, and look forward to seeing you during our next educational events.
Thank you.